from this conference. Today we are going to hear 3 presentations, and I think it will be better if we will go through all the 3 presentations, and afterwards we will keep our questions and comments for the last part of our meeting. If everything is in order, then I think this is the best way to administrate the panel. I said that we have 3 speakers in our panel. The first paper will be presented by Vladimir Lukic from University of Pardubice. Yeah, the paper is Virtues of Human Enhancement, McIntyre's Objection, and a Different Perspective. So, Vladimir, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so kindly for the introduction. First and foremost, thank you for accepting me for your conference. It is a pleasure to be here. And without any further ado, I would like to start presenting the topic I have admitted for this conference. So can I share my screen? I am awesome. So first and foremost, I would like to give a little bit of an introduction to why I think this topic is rather interesting. McIntyre is writing a paper, that is to say, he has written a paper in 1988, which is titled "The 7 Traits of Human Enhancement," or 7 traits of how to design our predecessors and in this paper he argues that he wants to talk about 2 specific things. The first thing is, what should our predecessors be like? And the other thing is, like, should we design them in a specific way? So in this design area, he talks about either education or eugenics from his perspective. And he immediately disregards the category of eugenics because he finds it to be more or less immoral, so to speak. So he focuses on the educational part. How should the parents educate their children, or what virtues should the children and later generations have? And in this regard, McIntyre is promoting a certain set of virtues, which is before he has published works such as After Virtue or Whose Justice, Which Rationality. The first came 2 years after this text, and the second one came 9 years after this text. So I think this text is really relevant for the fact that it is being more or less referenced in the contemporary debate over transhumanism and on certain medical area and medical fields of ethics. So let us first and foremost see what these 7 traits for the future look like, or 7 virtues. This is where McIntyre gives his preliminary virtue categories, or categories of virtue. So the first virtue is the ability to live with the uncertainty. So McIntyre finds it that in the contemporary area, or at least in the 80s, where McIntyre did write his paper, there have been many paradigm shifts in the philosophy of science, in the science itself, in politics, and so on and so forth. So McIntyre thinks that our lives are uncertain in the regards in which we can't find any objective thing to hold on to, that is. And we need to learn to live with the uncertainty. We need to learn to live that objectivity is not so easily found as it seems. So we should design, or we should educate the future generations in the regards in which they can live with the uncertainty. So something is rather problematic here. And Tobin, for example, argues that MacIntyre's virtue is more or less mechanistic. MacIntyre finds us to be mechanistic beings in this virtue that are just simply living with the fact of constant change. And Tobin argues that we should have something which is prior to that mechanistic approach, and that is the reflective approach. Tobin argues that we should not only live with the uncertainty, we should be aware what happens during that paradigm shift, what happens when the paradigms change and we go on from one narrative to another narrative. And this virtue is problematic in many more regards, having in mind that it is based on a simplistic consideration of human psychology. And if we consider contemporary psychology, we can see that human beings are a lot more fluid than MacIntyre wants us to think in this regard. Anyhow, so the second virtue is roots in particularity. And this is connected to MacIntyre's contemporary or MacIntyre's future stance on narrative unity. And this is where MacIntyre writes about the communitarian systematic approach. He says that we are first and foremost encumbered into our particular society, and we derive rules, we derive virtues, we derive political sentiments, and so on and so forth from the particular society. And opposed to that stands a cosmopolitan man who is thrown into the world and he can't really find anything that he can connect to. And this is rather problematic, but I will get back to it a little bit later, because my main argument deals with this particular virtue. The third virtue is the non-manipulative relations. And this is a Kantian approach that MacIntyre introduces. He states something like Kant does. We shouldn't approach people only as instruments, but as a means to an end. That is to say, Kantian deontological approach is present here as well. And MacIntyre, I feel like he uses it as an addition to the second virtue in order to give a rule-based system to a particular society. And I feel like this is more or less not an independent virtue, and it always should be connected with the second one. However, again, my main argument will deal with it a little bit later. Finding vocation in one's work is where MacIntyre tells us that we should always feel the value of our work, of our activities. And this is, again, something which is really reminiscent of his later view of practice. He says there are internal and external goods, and like this is a view in which he states that internal goods are really important, and we should teach our future generations how to be more or less in line with those internal goods. One counter-argument might seem to arise from this is, well, what if our work is in an unjust society? Well, MacIntyre doesn't really talk about it much. Anyhow, accepting one's death is also a virtue according to MacIntyre, and he conceives this based on his narrative unity of the self, which states that we should consider ourselves to be a project, and we have a beginning, a middle, and the end. And if we consider ourselves to be a project, the end is a natural finish to that project, and we should accept our own death based on that finish line, so to speak. Hope and willingness to take up arms are something that are virtues that MacIntyre derives from his sentiments that are directed towards antiquity and to the medieval society. Hope is the sentiment which is something that MacIntyre thinks gives us something to withstand all of those hard situations which we find ourselves in. And willingness to take up arms is connected to the sentiment of bravery, which is found in the writings of philosophers such as Aristotle or Plato. And it is also really reminiscent of bravery in the sense in which you are protecting those values, those norms that you are very, very proud of. And now that we have listed all of the virtues, let us go forward and talk about the narrative and the psychological configuration. So McIntyre gives us a list of virtues. We have already mentioned them. And a couple of virtues I have mentioned fall under this critique that I want to give up now. 9 years later, after the writing of McIntyre's The 7 Traits for the Future, he writes Whose Justice, Which Rationality, in which McIntyre admits his defeat, more or less. He states that liberalism has become very well indeed a tradition, a global paradigm. So all of these virtues that McIntyre proposes are more or less incompatible with today's paradigm, because every paradigm comes with a specific set of virtues. Every paradigm comes with a specific psychological configuration of the individual. How should we live in one society depends on the social context, depends on the social narrative, based on McIntyre's view. And the personal narrative is a correspondence to that social narrative. So the virtues, such as you remember, roots in particularity, non-manipulative relations, finding vocation in one's work, accepting one's death, hope, and willingness to take up arms, is based on the narrative which McIntyre seemed to have taken for granted, based on his conclusion of naturalistic perfectionism that he finds in Aristotle. And I feel like McIntyre's position is a lot less sound after taking up McIntyre's later position, in which he does very well indeed proposes to us, that is, a concept of psychological configuration. That is to say, those virtues that we should teach our children doesn't really hold up to this day, because we have a secular society which has fragmented particularism and which has a cosmopolitan specific virtue, so to speak, or a specific sentiment. So we can't really think about McIntyre's old set of virtues in the same regard as we thought about them then. In this regard, we should also admittedly think about this different set of virtues based on our today's social context, and based on the transhumanist approach or philosophical approach. So here I would like to finish my presentation, and this will be my overall argument. So thank you for listening, and thank you so kindly for having me here again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was very, very interesting, and it was on the clock, because it was exactly 10 minutes long. So thank you very much, because I forgot to mention that it was already in the schedule. So thank you again. The questions and the remarks at the end of the meeting. Our next presentation comes from Mark Fries. Hello. Okay.
Hello.
Complutense University of Madrid, with the paper From Condottieri to PMSCs, the cultural evolution of moral attitudes towards mercenaries. Again, 10 minutes, but if I have this sign with 2 minutes, I don't know if it's visible. So
yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
Okay. If there is a need for it, I will use it. Thank you.
Okay.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let's see. Compartir pantalla. Am I screen sharing? Can you see the PowerPoint? Okay.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning into my presentation, and I also want to say thank you very much to our hosts for having this conference. So my presentation is called From Condottieri to PMSCs, the cultural evolution of moral attitudes towards mercenaries. The presentation will follow this order. So first I'll talk about what I mean by morality, and then explain what a mercenary is and how the moral attitudes towards them have changed over the last 500 years, and then what our current attitude is and what the consequence of that attitude will be for the future. So to start off, what is morality? So I'm taking an approach in my research that human morality is based on two parts, one a biological part and the other a cultural part. For the biological part, I'm using the interdependence hypothesis as proposed by Michael Tomasello, which takes 3 stages in human evolution for a behavioral regulatory device that we call morality. And it's based on cooperation, then the second personal morality, which is this idea of we. So we can work together as one unit, and then an objective morality, which is sort of like the cultural morality and more or less the morality that we understand today. And it's in quotes because it's not objective, although it behaves and feels objective, but it's still subjective to the different environments, both physical and cultural. And so you can see on the screen here a summary of the interdependence hypothesis. So you can see cooperation, second personal morality, objective morality. Okay, so that's the first part of morality. And then the second part, so what is morality? So once we get to the objective morality, morality still changes between different societies and from different times in their societies. So, so the question here is, so if we have this sort of biological base structure for morality, how does it change once you're in the objective morality? And my argument for this is using intersubjective reality as argued by Yuval Noah Harari, and that is intersubjective entities depend on communication. So we have to tell each other stories, we have to tell each other narratives for us to be able to cooperate on large scales. And so depending, once again, like I said before, depending on the environment, depends on how those stories develop. So the environment here includes both the natural environment, so whether you live in a desert climate, a tropical climate, or a temperate climate, and depending on what stories had existed before. So depending on what narrative your society has told, depends on how future morality will develop. So I want to take this idea and apply it to a particular circumstance, and that is that of mercenaries. So what is a mercenary to begin with? Well, a basic definition of mercenaries is an armed civilian paid to do military operations in a foreign conflict zone. This is by Sean McFate. And over the last 500 years, there's been essentially 3 types of mercenary. In the Middle Ages, something called a condottieri, which were contractors who agreed to perform military operations as signed in the contract. So condottieri is contractors. And then in the modern era, after the Treaty of Westphalia, we get this sort of lone wolf adventurer depiction, which you see a lot in Hollywood films, although this is historically a very rare instance, but it was the idea in modern times. And then in contemporary times, we have private contractors, which, like the condottieri, provide services based on contracts. So then the three moral attitudes that correspond with these different types are go in chronological order here of the medieval era, which is pre-1648, which during that time, being a mercenary was considered honorable in the sense of it was like any other job. So you would hire a carpenter to do woodwork, you'd hire a mercenary to take care of your war work. And then after the 30 Years' War, which was the pinnacle of mercenarism, you have the Treaty of Westphalia, where the states, the powerful states of Europe, came together and said, no, we can't have that anymore because it was so destructive. And that set the stage for the state-centric order that we know today, which is also sometimes called the Westphalian order. And during this time, the mercenaries that existed before were absorbed by the state, and mercenaries were then seen as illegitimate, immoral, and sort of the dogs of war. Right. And then the third attitude, which is our contemporary attitude, which is since the end of the Cold War, and in particular in the post 9/11 era, the use of private force has come back, particularly because of the US outsourcing of military force during the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which also injected billions of dollars into the market. And now, because of this use by the US government, private military companies, so mercenaries, are seen as permissible to use now. So it's not quite the same as in the medieval era, where it was a business as any other. It's not fully morally acceptable, but it's permissible, right? So it's acceptable, not fully, not fully moral at the same time. So it's a bit different than before. So what does this current attitude mean for our future, right? So if we're taking my moral research and applying it, the idea of this is that by analyzing the trends and the changes in moral attitudes, then we can see what sort of the consequences of those moral attitudes are. And what we're looking at with the return to private war is something called neo-medievalism, which means a system of overlapping authority and multiple loyalty, according to Haley Ball. And so this is to reflect how it was in medieval Europe, where you had kings, different families, different companies, different political institutions competing for authorities and loyalties of the subjects in the area. And with the return of private force, there's a loss of the state-centric monopoly of force, because non-state actors can afford to enter into the battlefield. So large corporations, thank you, large corporations, wealthy individuals, non-governmental organizations, terrorist groups, drug cartels can all afford to use military level force to control a territory. And the moral significance of this is that the human rights regime that we've sort of built up in the state-centric Westphalian order is going to be challenged, because there's multiple actors who can control areas that can, tell state governments, state militaries to go away, essentially, because you control it. Large corporations can control their mining facilities, their petroleum extraction facilities. Of course, NGOs can also use them and do use them. And also the threat of perpetual war, because this is a business and their business interest is war, will also increase. So to conclude, human morality is based on, is interdependent and intersubjective. Mercenaries are civilians paid to perform military operations. The three attitudes towards, moral attitudes towards mercenaries over the last half millennium have been honorable, immoral, and permissible, and that current permissibility suggests that the future of the global order, international order, will be that of a neo-medievalistic one with overlapping authorities and loyalties. Thank you very much. I hope that you found this presentation interesting, and if you have any questions, you can ask me during the discussion session.
Thank you. Thank you very much for very, very, very interesting presentation and very challenging topic. We will go to our next speaker, who comes from Queen's University, Belfast, with a paper, The Moral Inequality of Non-Combatants in Just War Theory. Femi, if you, let's see. Okay, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so very much. I will just take a minute to share my screen.
Again, 10 minutes, and I will signal the 2 minutes limit. Okay.
So yeah, thank you so very much. I am grateful for the opportunity to be part of this discussion, and I've gained a lot. I mean, and I hope my presentation will be very interesting as well. So I'll be talking on the moral inequality of non-combatants in just war theory. And when I talk about the moral inequality of non-combatants in just war theory, starting with the traditional view in just war theory, the view is there are two main actors in war. There are the combatants and the non-combatants. And in just war theory, traditionally they believe non-combatants are not liable to attack. So those that are liable to attack are mainly combatants. But I'm using this presentation to argue that there are some non-combatants that may be liable to attack in war. And I'm basing it on what I call the asymmetric approach or asymmetric thesis. So my presentation is in this format. First, I'll be looking into the symmetry thesis and asymmetric thesis, because asymmetric thesis is opposed to symmetric thesis. And the other part will be MINC, that is the moral inequality of non-combatants, and the asymmetric thesis. What is the connection between them? And the next one will be arguments against the asymmetric thesis, that is existing arguments against asymmetric thesis. And the other one I'll be looking into Minkman's defense of the asymmetric thesis. And the other one will be the further support. I'll be looking into the further support for the asymmetric thesis. And I think that will be my main focus there. So yeah, the first thing is asymmetric thesis in just war theory is a view that only combatants are permitted to fight in war. And because of that, they are the only ones that are liable to attack. And there are two main parts of the symmetric thesis. One, notwithstanding the position of the combatants, whether they are fighting for just cause or unjust cause, they are both liable to attack. They have equal rights to attack and equal rights to defend themselves. And the other point about this symmetric thesis is that non-combatants from any side of the war, whether they are just or they are unjust, they are not liable to attack. This is what is more or less called the principle of non-combatant immunity. That is, non-combatants are immune to attack. But this is opposed to the position of asymmetric thesis. So asymmetric thesis is opposed to the position of symmetric thesis. And I'm looking at asymmetric thesis from the perspective of Jeff Mickman. So according to Jeff Mickman, non-combatants can be attacked based on 3 factors. 1, if they're having a high degree of responsibility for unjust cause, unjust war, then they could be attacked. That is 1. 2, if attacking them is going to achieve a just end for a just purpose, then they could be attacked. And the 3rd one is if they can be attacked without any harm to innocent civilians, then they should be attacked. But mind you, these 3 elements are not standing alone. They must come together before we can say, yes, we can attack non-combatants. So asymmetric thesis is the framework that supports my position, that is the moral inequality of non-combatants in war. Why asymmetric thesis is saying non-combatants are the same, asymmetric thesis is saying no. Some non-combatants can be liable to attack and some non-combatants are not liable to attack. So I'll be trying to defend asymmetric thesis because, in other words, if asymmetric thesis is true, then MINC, that is the moral inequality of non-combatants, is also true. So I will try as much as possible to defend the asymmetric thesis. But first, I will be looking into the challenges for the asymmetric thesis. So, like I've mentioned, MINC is linked to asymmetric thesis. So it's a framework to defend asymmetric thesis. Because of time, I will just skip this slide because I think I've mentioned a little bit about it. So what are the arguments against the asymmetric thesis? The first one is called the epistemic problem. So due to the complexities of war, it can be difficult to know which war is just and unjust. And if we cannot know which war is just and unjust, then how can we say these are the group of non-combatants that should be liable to attack? Because in some cases, there are some wars where the leaders of the country or a state may mislead the citizens, thinking that their war is the just one, and they will think they're fighting for a just cause. And on that note, they will be ignorantly fighting an unjust war. And if they're ignorantly fighting an unjust war, then according to maybe Cecil Faber, she was saying they are innocent, we should not attack them. So that's the first problem. War can be complex, and because of that complexity, it can be difficult to know which side is just and unjust. And the next one is the applicability challenge. In other words, it will be difficult to apply asymmetric thesis in war because people that are considered unjust, they will not like to accept asymmetric rule of war. They'll be thinking this law is not supporting us, then we are not going to support it. An example is the rejection of the additional protocol to the Geneva Convention by the United States because they believe it's not in support of them, so they rejected it. So if any rule under asymmetric approach is not in support of certain side of the war, they may not accept it. So that's going to be a big challenge for the asymmetric thesis. And the other one is the problem of reduced compliance. This is in 2 perspectives. 1, those that are considered just, they will want to fight without thinking of the consequences because they believe we are considered the just soldier, so we can fight anyhow, we can kill anyhow just to achieve our just end. And those that are considered unjust, we believe since we've been considered unjust, then what are we going to lose? It's just like considering an example of Hamas and Israel, because internationally people believe Hamas, they are the unjust fighters. So they will think we don't have any reputation to lose. We are already considered unjust. So let's fight to kill as much as possible and to defend ourselves. And Israel will be saying, oh, we're having the legitimate reason to defend ourselves. Like, I mean, Joe Biden was saying Israel is having a legitimate reason to defend itself. So they consider them as just. So from the 2 sides, they will not be complying with the rules of asymmetric thesis because they believe, 1, we are considered unjust, we can fight as much as possible. And those that are considered just will think, yes, we are fighting for a just cause, we can also fight as much as possible. So asymmetric thesis may not be very practical. That's the main point. And Mickman tries to defend the asymmetric thesis, and I'll be looking into his defense. The first one is about responses to the epistemic problem. So he said, some people may be having subjective justification. On one hand, they'll be thinking, yes, because of certain reasons, we believe we are fighting a just cause. And their reasons may be wrong because they've been misled, like I mentioned. And some people will be having objective justifications. But Mickman is saying those that are having subjective justification, they are liable to attack because subjective justification is just within some group of people. So if they don't have objective justification, then they are liable to attack. They are only not liable to attack if they have objective justification, and that is one. The second response under the epistemic problem is that he said it is important to consider the notion of ignorance as something that is not overarching. It's not an overarching problem, because one, the give me a minute, please. He said it's not an overarching problem because some wars can be known as just and unjust. Though we may be thinking most wars are unjust, but there are some wars we can know even before the fight. We can say this war is just, this war is not unjust. And he's trying to defend the epistemic problem, like, no, there are some wars that can be just and there are some wars that can be unjust. And he responded to the epistemic challenge. In his response to the epistemic challenge, he thinks that because the morality of war is based on, is the framework to support he said the morality of war is a framework to support the asymmetric thesis. So that is why people are not accepting it. But because the law of war is the one supporting the asymmetric thesis, that is why people are accepting it. In other words, the law of war is human-made. He said the law of war is human-made and people can manipulate it the way they want. That is why it's acceptable. And for the morality of war is the framework in support of the asymmetric thesis. That is why people are not accepting it. That is his defense for the applicability challenge. But mind you, before I go on, Mickman here is just trying to explain the problem. He's not really solving the problem. And the third response is to the reduced compliance. Mickman is giving 2 points here. The first one is that we can enforce it. We can enforce a symmetry rule of war on the people, just like people enforce symmetry rules of war on people. And the second point, he said, if people see the benefit of a symmetric rule of law, then they will accept it. But the problem here is how can we enforce it if people are not ready to accept it? That is one. How can we get the benefit if people are not interested in accepting it? That is two. So Mickman was saying, okay, we should have, what's it called? A tribunal, an epistemic tribunal that will be in charge of making the regulations that this is a war that is just and this is a war that is unjust. So based on that epistemic tribunal, Mickman's position is very, very tricky. It's difficult to support his view because how can we have an epistemic tribunal? That is another side that is so complex. So, but because of that, the notion of asymmetric thesis is not acceptable in just, it's not so much acceptable in just war theory. But I'm trying to give some support to asymmetric thesis. One, I said asymmetric thesis defends just war theory more than the symmetric thesis, because asymmetric thesis is mainly achieving the purpose of just war theory. And the purpose of just war theory is one, to make sure that war is fought in a just way. And looking at the asymmetric thesis, is saying we should make sure that we don't fight, we know the nature of our fight before we fight. Like we should not just go into war and then, just like asymmetric thesis is claiming that we should start the war and see the consequence. But asymmetric thesis is saying, no, we should know the nature of the war before we go into that war. So because of time, we just be jumping to the C aspect. So asymmetric thesis is also grappling the issue of civilian participation in war. In other words, civilians can participate in war, unlike what asymmetric thesis is saying, that civilians cannot participate in war. And by civilians, I'm talking about non-combatants. So for asymmetric thesis, civilians can participate in war. And if they participate in war, we should distinguish them from those that are not participating. It would be unjust to consider both non-participants and participants as equally protected by the principle of non-combatant immunity. It is better for us to distinguish them. So in other words, I'm trying to claim here that asymmetric thesis is closer to achieving the principle or the objectives of just war theory more than the asymmetric thesis. And nonetheless, despite the difficulty in terms of having a tribunal, I still believe that asymmetric thesis is very much applicable in just war theory and should be encouraged. So I think because of time, I will just be stopping, and whatever, any aspect that I've omitted, I believe maybe during the question and answer, we may be able to cover them again. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, if there are any questions or remarks or comments for the speakers, please. Yeah. Well, and let's see if okay, we have Femi raised his hand.
Sorry, although, I mean, thank you very much. Although the time is so short, and I'm so much interested in all the presentations, particularly, I guess Mark's presentation is very much connected with mine, though I was not having enough time to explore everything. So Mark was talking about I'm trying to make sure I get it right. Mark was talking about terrorist organizations and some other group of people that are non-state actors, that they can participate in war. So I was thinking, non-state, because in international law, this group of people, they are not considered as legal entities in law. So if non-state actors are fighting with state actors, I mean, we have the example of Hamas and Israel at the moment. So how can we, because for example, the United States, United Kingdom, the foreign secretary was saying, oh, we can only talk with Israel, we cannot talk with Hamas. We have a principle of non-contact. So people, they don't want to talk with terrorist organizations because they consider them as non-legal and international entities. So how can international law broker peace between non-state actors and state actors if non-state actors are not recognized as legal entities? That's just my question. I don't know, maybe I'm making sense. Is it clear? Thank you.
Shall I answer that now, or okay?
Yes, I think Mihaela. Sorry, Mihaela. Okay. Yes. Now, please.
Okay. So I wasn't just talking about terrorist groups only, but they would be one example of a non-state actor. But pretty much any non-state actor with enough funds has access or can have access to military level force now. So this could be, yes, terrorist groups. It could also be large corporations. It could be NGOs. It could be drug cartels. So, or wealthy individuals. For example, Mark Zuckerberg or Elon Musk definitely have enough money to raise a private army at the moment, if they wanted to. And as far as like the international law and private force, this is part of the problem, is that, or issue, that the privatization of force, so going back to the historical norm of mercenaries and private war, undermines this international law, right? So international law is set up as a state-to-state basis. So if you're a non-state actor, the system has a difficult time talking to you or accepting to talk to you if you're that non-state actor, right? But non-state actors being able to access military force puts them into a new negotiating position. So I don't know what this means exactly for the future of international law, but it will make enforcing it a lot more difficult. Does that answer your question?
Thank you for the question and also for the answer. If there are any other questions now, yes, Vladimir.
I mean, both of the participants had such an interesting topic and an interesting point later on. Like I felt like it was such an interesting topic to explore. And I have one question which is concerned with the concept of a mercenary based on Mark's presentation. And having in mind that the presentation time is rather short and most of the things that should be said or would be said aren't said. I know this based on my presentation as well. So I just want to ask the question based on the conceptual change of the concept of the mercenary. I mean, it was mentioned that it changed both in the medieval times, in the modern times, in the contemporary times, blah blah blah. And can you explain a little bit more on that change, on how we perceive the concept of a mercenary and how did the change arise? Because a mercenary has a specifically different meaning now than it had in a different era, that is to say. Thank you.
Yeah, so the understanding and the attitudes, the moral attitudes toward them change. And so this is particularly what I'm researching into. And so for example, after the Treaty of Westphalia, other environmental changes in this case happened. In this case, not natural ones, but technological ones. So it became possible to mass produce easy to use weapons, so you could train people very quickly. In the medieval era, you had to be very specialized to use weapons. So this was also a contributing factor into the decline of mercenaries in the last 400 years, because the nature of war changed, technology changed, which changed that war. And so if you were a highly specialized soldier, you actually became sort of outdated at this point, because you could produce muskets very quickly that were easy to use, and you could train. You could go to a village, and you could get all the potential soldiers there and train them in a week, say. That's not exact, but just to make a point here, where you might have had to take a few years to train beforehand. And this change is happening again since the collapse or since the end of the Cold War. The big total wars, state-on-state wars diminished, and we have a lot of asymmetrical wars. So this is actually similar to your thesis, Femi, that war is becoming asymmetrical. So you have a very large power, such as the United States, going after a non-state actor, such as Al-Qaeda or IS or something like that. And mass war, total war, is no longer advantageous. Specialized units are what's most effective. So you're going back to the need for a specialized military unit, like in the medieval times. And when that happens, there seems to be a trend that suggests private war develops when the need for special soldiers, specialized soldiering is necessary, and when it's more effective to have cheap, mass-produced soldiers is more effective. So that's an example of how the environmental conditions affect the change of attitudes.
Thank you, Mr. Khan. That was a perfect response.
Yes, Femi raised his hand. Mihaela, can we still discuss?
I think one more question is okay, and after that we will have to wrap it up.
Yes. Okay, Femi, please.
Is Mark having a question? Because I've had one. Maybe Mark can go. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, I do have questions for both of you, but if there's not enough time, that's okay. So if you want to ask, or However,
No, I think you can go because I've had one question, because you've not had any question, so it's fine. You can, because they said there's no time, so it's fine for you to go.
yeah. Okay, I suppose Vladimir, I'll ask my question to you. So in the 7 virtues, there was one that sort of, I thought it was a bit surprising that that was put up. So there was the idea of non-manipulation, and then the willingness to take up arms. And I was wondering if you could explain how. Sorry, what was it? What was the author's name? Sorry.
McIntyre.
McIntyre. Yeah, I was wondering if you could explain how, or if McIntyre sort of how he explains the existence of those two together, since one is saying don't coerce and the other one is coercive.
So McIntyre's, I think it is linked with McIntyre's particularism, because McIntyre is a communitarian and he imagines every society being a little bit more closed off than they are now at this very moment. So, for example, you have a society A and a society B, and let's say you introduce all of those virtues in the society A. Society B doesn't necessarily have to have the same virtues, and they can coerce society A in this regard. So society A might have the virtue of non-manipulative relations. So like everyone in the society A is very peachy towards one another. However, if the society B comes attacking society A has to have the willingness to take up arms and to defend the virtues and defend the values that they stand on that basis of values, that is. So in this regard, it is more or less a reactive set of virtues. But still, I find it really problematic, in the same regards in which willingness to take up arms can be considered both a defensive and aggressive mechanism. So it's rather interesting, a question. It's a rather interesting question, that is. Thank you.
Well, thank you once again for participating at this panel and to our international conference. I really hope that we can host you one day in real life, not only here on Zoom, although Zoom is quite comfortable. But nevertheless, I think that that we could benefit a lot if you could visit our university one day. And with this, I will stop the Facebook live stream. And I would want to